When I was looking for a place to live, I wasn't very picky. I just needed a normal removable option where I could sleep, work, and not worry about everyday problems. After several weeks of searching, I came across an ad. A room in an apartment, reasonable price, convenient location. The only condition is that the neighbor already lives there, and preference is given to people with irregular work schedules. I thought it was even convenient. I was a freelancer myself, often working nights and sleeping it off during the day. So I didn't want neighbors who start making coffee and rattling pots at 7 in the morning. I quickly contacted the owner, and he said that my potential neighbor is a quiet, inconspicuous person, but with special features. I didn't think much of it at the time. When I came to look at the apartment, I was met by a guy in his 30s. He looked tired, but he was smiling politely. Introduced himself as Mark. The apartment was ordinary. 2 bedrooms, a shared living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. A little old renovation, but overall cozy. Mark gave me a tour, briefly told me about the rules. Do not enter his room without permission, do not touch his things, and do not ask unnecessary questions. The last one made me a little uneasy, but I thought maybe he was just an introvert. Not everyone likes to chat. Do you come home often? I asked more out of politeness. Almost none, he replied. I work at different times, sometimes even at night. Great. This meant that we would rarely cross paths. I agreed to rent a room and moved in 3 days later. At first, everything was fine. We hardly crossed paths, and if we did, we exchanged a few words. Mark was clean, didn't cause any problems, didn't make any noise. The only thing that seemed strange to me was that he never ate in front of me. I spent most of my time at home, and sometimes went into the kitchen in the middle of the night. There wasn't much food in the fridge, just some sealed containers. One day, I noticed that the food in them was changing, but Mark himself hadn't touched a single pot in a few days. One evening, I heard him come home. It was late, about 2 in the morning. I heard him go to his room, but after a minute, he came out again. There were soft sounds in the kitchen, as if he had opened the refrigerator. I decided to go out for water, and found him there. He stood in front of the open refrigerator, looked inside, but did not take anything. I took a quick look inside. The food was there. Is everything okay? I asked. He flinched, as if I'd caught him doing something forbidden, but then he nodded. Yes, I just forgot what I have. He quickly closed the refrigerator and went to his room. It seemed to me that he was worried about something. A couple of days later, I noticed another oddity. He always locked his room. When I was home alone, I tried to pull the handle. It was locked. The windows of his room were covered with thick curtains. Even during the day, there was almost no light. One night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was like someone was moving furniture. I looked at my watch, 3:14. I listened for a while, but the noise soon stopped. Since then, I started noticing more strange things. His shoes in the hallway were never dusty, even if it was raining. He left the house with an empty backpack and returned with it as if he wasn't carrying anything. One evening, he was sitting in the living room watching TV. I decided to sit down next to him. He switched channels, but he didn't stay anywhere. I was joking. Can't you find something interesting? He chuckled a little. Sometimes you just want to turn on something to create noise. It puzzled me a bit. So you're not watching? He shrugged his shoulders. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We talked a little more, but the conversation turned out to be strained. I found myself thinking that the longer I lived with him, the more uncomfortable I felt. And then I found the note. It was on the living room table, crumpled up as if it was going to be thrown away. I unfolded it and saw a few lines written in uneven handwriting. Remember, the main thing is not to lose control. Don't let them get suspicious. My stomach turned cold. I turned around, but I was alone. I didn't sleep that night. I've been looking at this note for a long time. The paper was wrinkled, but not too old, as if it had been crumpled recently. Whose handwriting is this? The brand? Or was there someone else in this apartment? I carefully folded the note and put it in my pocket. My heart was pounding louder than usual. I tried to calm myself down with logic. Maybe it's just something personal, maybe a work note or a reminder. But what did it mean to not lose control? Control over what? I lay back down, but sleep never came. The next morning, Mark behaved as usual. He came out of his room, nodded dryly at me, made coffee without saying a word, and left again. He didn't even seem to notice that I looked tired. I tried to convince myself that this note had nothing to do with me, but the feeling of anxiety wouldn't go away. I decided to find out more about the brand. I searched the internet, but all I found was his social media page, which was empty, with no photos or personal information. A few subscriptions, a couple of old posts, nothing suspicious. It feels like he existed, but he didn't leave anything behind. I continued to watch him. He came and went at different times, but he never said where he was going. Sometimes he stayed in the bathroom for strangely long periods, and one day I noticed that there were small cuts on his hands. I asked, "Are you hurt?" He glanced at his palms, clenched his fingers, and answered briefly, "Nonsense." I didn't ask any further, but inside, everything shrank from a feeling that I was living next to something I didn't understand. And then something happened that completely knocked me out of my rut. I came home earlier than usual. Mark wasn't there. When I passed by his room, I heard sound. It was as if something had slid across the floor. I froze. The room was locked, as always. I knocked softly. There was no response. I took a step back, but inside everything screamed that I needed to know what was there. I took the wire from a kitchen table. I wasn't much good at picking locks, but this door was old. After a minute, it opened softly. I looked inside. The room looked strange. It was almost empty except for a mattress on the floor, a couple of boxes, and a desk with papers. There was a calendar on the wall, but all the dates had been crossed out. I took a step inside. There was a stack of written sheets on the table. I took one and read it. "If they start suspecting something, leave." I felt my stomach turn cold. At that moment, I heard the front door lock click. Mark is back. I froze. My heart thumped in my chest. It flashed through my head. If he sees me here, it's over. The door to the apartment closed. I heard Mark take off his shoes. He was only a few steps away from the room. I carefully put the note back in the pile, closed the door as quietly as possible, and took a step back into the hallway. Mark appeared around the corner. "What are you doing here?" His voice is steady, but there's something wary in his eyes. I wanted to ask, have you ever been involved in something like psychology? The first thing that came to mind. I saw a calendar, strange notes. His gaze lingered on the door of his room. "I'm writing myself reminders," he said shortly. "Why would you?" I shrugged, trying to look nonchalant. "Just curious." He stood there for a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay, I'm tired, I need to rest." I took the hint and went to my room, closing the door behind me. I tried to convince myself that nothing terrible had happened, but everything inside was shrinking. Something about Mark was wrong. That night, I heard the noise again. It was like furniture was being moved, then the creak of floorboards. I wanted to get up, but something made me stay in bed. I was just listening. After a couple of minutes, everything went quiet. The following days were stressful. Mark became even more withdrawn. If before he had at least pretended to lead a normal life, now he hardly spoke. Sometimes I caught his gaze, cold, appraising, and then I noticed another detail. There was a crumpled piece of paper in the kitchen trash can. I unwrapped it. They suspect something. Time is running out. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided it was time to find out exactly what my strange neighbor was doing. I couldn't just let it go. I needed to know what was going on. Mark was behaving more and more strangely, and I couldn't continue to live with this feeling that something was wrong. The next day, when I noticed that Mark was leaving for the day again, I decided it was time. I waited until his footsteps had died away and exhaled. I could end this. Don't ask unnecessary questions. I had to find out what he was doing. I returned to his room, even more determined this time. The lock was still old, but despite its fragility, it was quite sturdy. On the other hand, I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would feel this terrible impasse again. I knew I couldn't stay calm. I needed to find at least one explanation, at least something that could help me understand what was really going on. Like last time, I used a wire to pry open the door. This time it was a little easier because I already knew how to act, but my heart was still pounding like crazy. The door opened with a slight creak. I entered quietly, trying not to make any sounds. The room was almost empty, just like last time, but now I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. There was a large box on the floor. It was closed, but the corner of it was slightly ajar. I couldn't resist and pulled the lid, not thinking that Mark might come back. The box was filled with some old papers, notes, journals, and something else. Something heavy was lying below, hidden by other things. I carefully sorted through the papers, and then my fingers came across a hard object. I pulled it out and saw a metal object that looked like a small tool. My hands were shaking as I looked at it. It was like a small screen with a bunch of buttons and some incomprehensible symbols. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel the tension building. I hugged him to me, but at that moment I heard the floor creaking in the hallway. I froze. It was the sound of someone's footsteps. I quickly put the instrument in my pocket and ran back to my room, pretending that nothing had happened. I turned off the light and got into bed, trying not to breathe too loudly. I heard Mark's door close. He's back. It took a few minutes before I could exhale, but my heart was still pounding. In the evening, when I calmed down, I thought about what had happened again. This strange metal object. What was that? Why does Mark keep such things in his room? I couldn't help but think about it, but I didn't know what to do next. The next day, when I decided that I wasn't ready to fully meet Mark yet, I decided to explore the device more closely. When I turned it on, I saw that the screen lit up and showed some random images. They were changing very quickly. Everything was in motion. I didn't understand anything, but suddenly the screen was overshadowed by strange symbols. They started appearing so fast that I didn't have time to read them. The device hummed as if it was transmitting something. At that moment, I realized that it looked like I wasn't the only one who might have been watching something. I sat there looking at that screen, and the more I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. The symbols kept changing, and the device kept humming. I didn't understand what was going on, but the feeling of anxiety wouldn't leave me. I decided I should turn it off and get back to normal, but that's when the screen flashed and everything went black. I felt a strange silence pressing down on me. The room was too quiet. There was no familiar computer sound, not even any noise from outside. Just this thick, heavy air. I tried to turn the device back on, but it wouldn't budge. The screen was gone. I clicked on a few buttons, but the result didn't change. I don't know why, but I became even more anxious. The feeling that I didn't understand something was growing. It was as if I was walking on a dangerous edge and knew that if I took a step sideways, it would be impossible to return. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. It was Mark's footsteps. He was coming back, and with every step, the anxiety inside me grew. I put the device in my pocket and quickly returned to my bed. I knew that if he saw me now, I would be in trouble. As soon as Mark entered the room, I felt his gaze directed in my direction. He didn't say a word, but his silence was so expressive that it made me uneasy. It seemed to me that he knew for sure that I had found something. But what exactly? I did not know. I couldn't keep this horror to myself. That evening, when he left again, I decided to act. I couldn't sit on the sidelines. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I went back to that metal device and tried to turn it on again. And this time, it worked. The screen lit up, and instead of random characters, I saw the whole picture. It was a video. Footage appeared on the screen, which at first seemed completely ordinary to me. It was a camera shot, but later I realized that it was the same corner in the apartment where the camera was. A camera that was pointed right at my door, and another camera pointed at my bed. At that moment, I realized that I was under surveillance. All this time, while I was living with Mark, I was just part of some kind of game. The device continued to show footage, as if under a microscope, I was in the field of view of this device all the time. Everything I did, all my movements, everything was recorded. It wasn't an accident, not some kind of random coincidence. Mark knew my every move. I don't know what shocked me more, the fact that I was under surveillance or the fact that at some point on this screen, I saw Mark himself. He was standing in a dark corner of my room when I came in and turned on the device. I almost fell over when I realized that he might have seen me the whole time. And then I realized that everything that was happening between us had been thought out in advance, planned in advance. Everything from his strange notes to the unexpected silence that haunted me was no accident. But the scariest thing of all, perhaps, was that at some point Mark got up and came to my bed. He was silent, and his face was absolutely motionless, cold. I sat there unable to move. I thought he was going to say something, but he just watched me in silence. And then I realized that I was not a part of the game, but its main player. Mark knew that I would be looking for answers. He knew that I would try to figure out what was going on, and he was waiting for this moment. I couldn't get enough air. I was ready to go crazy. But he just looked at me and quietly, without any expression, said, "You got it, didn't you? Now it's time to play by my rules." That was the moment that I couldn't believe anymore. I sat there, unable to look away from his cold eyes. Every word he said hit me in the head like a heavy weight, and I couldn't understand what was going on. Everything was mixed up in my head, this horror, this realization that I was probably part of something I didn't even know about. At some point, it seemed to me that I had completely lost my mind. Mark took a step towards me, and I froze. He wasn't in a hurry. His movements were precise, as if he knew I wouldn't dare to resist. I tried to say at least one word, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, staring at him in shock. He wasn't just a person. He was part of something that couldn't be explained. "You don't understand," Mark said, and his voice was strangely calm now. Everything you see, everything you feel is part of the game. You should have seen it. You should have understood. I was on the verge of a breakdown. The brain simply refused to accept this reality. I began to realize that all my actions, all the moments when I thought something was wrong, when I didn't really feel something, it was all a setup. He was always there, always watching, but it never occurred to me that I could be a part of something so terrible. And suddenly, he said something that changed everything. Do you know what the strangest thing is? You weren't the first. You're not the first one who's been here. There were others before you, and they were also looking for answers. But you're probably the closest to a solution. That's why I'm here. To see how far you can take it. My heart skipped a beat. He said something that opened my eyes. He wasn't just watching me. He did it with others. And those who came before me were the same as me, confused and confused. I stood up, trying to sort my thoughts out, but nothing worked. I felt like everything around me was collapsing. When I started moving, he started talking again. You've been trying to figure out the device, haven't you? I told you, take your time. All this is preparation. You should have realized that we're not just random people. We are participants in something much bigger. You don't know who you really are. I stood there, shocked by this revelation, but his words continued to torment me. He wasn't human. He was someone else. But who? And what does he mean by saying that I should have understood something? I didn't know what to do anymore. Run, try to find answers, or just give in and accept reality. And suddenly, as if under the influence of some force, I remembered something. This calendar. All those weird notes I've seen. All those moments when I felt that something was wrong, that something was constantly watching me. I couldn't forget how at one point he just watched me without saying a word. He knew. He always knew that I would be looking for answers, but this was no ordinary search. Do you understand what I mean? Mark broke my silence again. You are the mystery. And then it literally dawned on me. All this time, I was not just an observer. I was a participant. No, not a participant in the game, as I thought before. I was the cause of it. I was the very element they were looking for. These records, these strange symbols, the device. It was all about me. I was connected to this, to his game, to this nightmare. Mark suddenly smiled. But it wasn't just a smile. It was the kind of smile that made me realize that I had lost not only control over what was happening, but also my freedom. Now I was part of the process. And no matter what I do, I won't be able to escape. You were part of the experiment, and this experiment is over. But you're not the only one who's been through this. The question is, can you get through this, to the end? I stood there, unable to say anything, realizing that this moment was fatal. And when Mark looked at me for the last time, I realized that now everything I would do would be part of what I was trying to understand. I wasn't just a player. I was a part of what was happening. And now I have no choice. When Mark said these words, I felt the world around me freeze and gradually sink into an icy silence. I stood there, unable to move, realizing that my life had long since turned into someone else's game, an experiment in which I was a pawn. Suddenly, there was a soft but confident knock on the door. I heard footsteps moving away from a hallway, and I realized that someone else knew about it, and someone had come to check the results. Before I could collect my thoughts, I heard a voice outside the door, a voice full of cold determination and emotionless severity. The door opened, and two strangers in business suits appeared on the threshold, their faces not expressing the slightest sympathy. They quickly, and without further ado, invited me to follow them, and at the same moment, I felt my attempts to resist turning into futility. I was taken to a small, sterile room where a man with an icy gaze sat at a large table, as if he had been specially created to deprive a person of all hope. He introduced himself as the head of a project, an experiment that I was just beginning to suspect, and his voice was even, as if he wasn't delivering terrible news, but routine information. You thought your life was just an accident, he began without looking up, but in fact you were chosen, selected for your character, for your reaction to stress. We've been watching you since you moved in. Every detail, every little thing was recorded. You were part of our exploration of human limits. And now the experiment is over. These words echoed in my head, making me realize the cruelty and coldness of what was happening. I tried to find the words, tried to ask why me, but suddenly I realized that there would be no more questions. I was immobilized, and I felt my last attempts to resist turning into a senseless, rebellious heart whose beats were getting quieter and fainter. The supervisor continued, "You are not the first to go through this ordeal. There were many people like you before you, people who were promised a normal life. But the truth is that freedom is just an illusion. You were part of the experiment, part of our observation. And when we were sure that we had achieved the desired result, we made a decision. Your participation is over. In that second, I realized that every suspicion I had, every attempt to find answers, was all aimed at assessing my reaction in order to collect data on how a person copes with the realization of a complete loss of control over their life. A chill ran down my spine when I realized I couldn't get out. The doors, windows, even the hallway were all sealed, as if a specially constructed lair for the victim. Time seemed to stop when I heard the click of the mechanism, signaling that the final time had come. The supervisor pressed a button, and at the same moment, human operatives burst into the room, who, without expressing the slightest doubt, began their duties. I tried to scream, tried to convey my pain to them, but the words stuck in my throat. My last moments were filled with a sense of complete loss when I realized that my whole world, all my dreams and hopes, were just an experiment in which I never had the right to choose. And so when the cold hand of reality finally shackled me, I realized that the real horror lies not in the supernatural, not in mysticism, but in the fact that people are able to ruthlessly use others, turning them into objects for their soulless experiments. My scream, my last sigh, all this became just a record, data for analysis, part of a system where freedom never existed. At that last moment, I realized that my life was meaningless, and my fate was just a terrible ending that remained forever etched in the memory of ruthless observers.